Hey there! So this is a $50 Patreon request I received from Justin Newsome. Thank you so much for the patronage, and if anyone in the audience is interested in ensuring a video request, all of my $50 patrons are guaranteed one. So, specifically, what was asked was for an answer to the presence of vigilante justice in a stateless society, and how society would deal with it. And really, there isn't all that much that can be said about this, since the entire debate surrounding the concept of a vigilante taking the law into their own hands in the absence of a government's monopoly on arbitration, without any regards to ethics or morality, is simply statist propaganda. Now, this isn't to say that people don't try to coerce or initiate force against another person who hasn't committed a crime or hasn't already paid for what they've done, nor wouldn't in the absence of a state, but this line of reasoning creates a false dichotomy, carries a series of snuck assertions, and applies various fallacious lines of reasoning. The first of which is that the state's laws are themselves objective, and the enforcement or creation of them are in no way arbitrarily influenced by any factors outside of what's demonstrably justified, and that without a monopoly on arbitration, people would be reduced to the Hobbesian state of nature and society would devolve into complete barbarism. Now, this is, of course, crap, to put it simply. First of all, because the government for each given country is the only organization which can settle disputes, can use force to suppress competition, and can coerce people into funding it, this means that politicians can effectively dictate ethics and morality without actually having to demonstrate their positions as being legitimate, meaning that the state can decide that people who've committed no crimes are criminals, criminals who've demonstrably victimized someone else have no responsibility to pay for their crimes, or simply that someone who has favor with the state can be held to a different standard. This is why people spend their entire lives in jail for crimes that have no victim, why police can murder people and get paid vacations, and why government employees don't have an obligation to serve you, yet you must be forced into having your money taken to pay for them. So, in reality, it's actually the state which behaves in a manner statists use to describe justice in the absence of a monopoly on arbitration, and the vigilante justice narrative is just projection. And if you're a longtime viewer of this channel, I'm sure you've seen my multiple explanations spanning across several videos of natural law, how there exist ethical conclusions that can be arrived at through reasoning alone as a result of logic being objective, and how we know that logic is objective, and in fact it's a performative contradiction to argue otherwise. But the question still remains, and is rarely touched upon by libertarians, on how exactly justice would work from a practical perspective in the absence of the state. But there's actually a good reason as to why this question doesn't have any concrete answers. This is because, like the vigilante justice versus the rule of law issue, it's inherently structured upon a false premise, which is that there is a universal, concrete, and punitive solution for every single crime which we can point to and demonstrate objectively as being legitimate in every case. Every crime and its circumstances are different from one another necessarily, since different individuals are involved in every case. Because of this, it's not possible to establish an objective payment for a crime because every victim has different preferences and therefore requires a different settlement to be agreed upon by the two parties having the dispute and any others whom they've chosen to be involved in the dispute. The arbiter and their insurance, the jury, if they've chosen to go to an arbiter which has one, take into consideration how they've agreed to contract with their arbiters and insurance, or the criminals and the victims between each other, whether it's paid for with capital, mutual aid, charity, loans, and what the arbiters or insurance want for their service, or what the victim wants. Simply put, there is not and cannot be a single punishment for any given crime decided by a centralized organization. The economic conditions under which a rule of law function aside, it is fundamentally impossible for a punitive model to produce any justified arbitration because the punitive model fundamentally only focuses on the criminal rather than restoration for the victim, and assumes that there can only be one settlement for any crime regardless of the individual circumstances. So the punitive model completely takes the victim out of the equation. And since the entire point of arbitration is for the criminal and the victim to both agree on a means by which the criminal can make up for what they've done, this can't even be considered arbitration. All it is victimizing who the arbiter in question deems to be an offender and leaving the victim with little to no restoration. And that's ultimately the issue with the method of what statists laughably call justice. The government's monopoly on arbitration can only operate based on the punitive model, since the state fundamentally requires coercion in order to fund themselves. And if someone resists, they need to be forced into paying them, since the individual in question here would not be victimizing anyone because the burden of proof is on the state, and the state has no justification for taking his money. So on top of having political and economic disincentives from actually being efficient and objective, it's fundamentally impossible for the state to provide justified arbitration, because simply justice in a state society has nothing to do with justice and only has to do with securing the political and financial interests of the government. In fact, in most cases, the state even acknowledges that the offender being punished hasn't victimized anyone. So much so that 86% of all prisoners in the United States alone are incarcerated for so-called victimless crimes. So arbitration with a state is itself by necessity an act of criminality, and that's all it ever can or will be. The irony of a politician or statist claiming that arbitration in the absence of the state's monopoly on arbitration would be barbaric is astounding. But with this being established, a question still remains, which is how exactly would arbitration without a rule of law be enforced? I mean, couldn't criminals just ignore a request to arbitration? And this question just further highlights how the entire debate around the current system of arbitration is structured around false dichotomies, false premises, logical fallacies, and is just generally completely divorced from reality. Unsurprising, given that the monopoly on arbitration, as demonstrated, can't be defended in any regard if analyzing how it functions from an objective point of view. It makes perfect sense that the fundamental manner by which the government puts on the facade of justifying its own actions is deliberately obscured by lies and propaganda down to the very core of how it functions. So this view completely disregards the influence and persuasive power of social cohesion. Without the state services creating a societal infrastructure, and with the existing infrastructure and stability of each individual's own lives being entirely dependent on the associations they secure for themselves and how they manage their own lives in the absence of a state, this makes everyone out of necessity become more cautious and take more responsibility over their actions and finances. This is not any sort of baseless assumption. This is actually based on an instinctive and documented psychological reaction the human psyche experiences to changes in environment known as neuroplasticity. So, basically, if you're an active criminal and you don't try to make up for what you've done, your life is pretty much over. No one will associate with you because of your status as a criminal who hasn't tried to make up for their crimes. That will make everyone around you assume that they can't trust you, that you're dangerous, and that you're a direct threat to them. So, there goes your ability to make a living because no one will want to trade with you, and without any money or means of trade, there goes the ability to secure your own existence. Even if you did have a means of trade, though, good luck finding someone who will trade with you because, again, you're a criminal and no one can trust you. So, essentially, it's in the criminal's interest to go to arbitration. Otherwise, they'll effectively be outcasted from society purely by individuals acting upon their own interests, without coercion. And because it's in everyone's interest, there's a high demand for resources and knowledge regarding who is or isn't an active criminal, so if you are a criminal, everyone will know about it. You wouldn't be able to skip town to try and hide from your past. No, they would know about it there, too. And no, you can't murder someone, kidnap someone, or initiate force against someone because they stole from you or some other petty crime. Force can only be used to the extent where it's necessary to defend from whatever crime the criminal is attempting to commit, because if you're in the passive position, the burden of proof remains on the would-be thief or any other form of aggressor, since an initiation of force is an active stance inherently, and therefore the burden of proof is always on the person who is initiating force. The initiation of force inherently cannot be defended since it infringes upon the agency of another person. So, for instance, if there is a thief trespassing on your property, you have the right to hold them at gunpoint and tell them to leave. This is because you're in the passive position, since you're simply defending yourself and your property. If someone were trespassing on your property and you were to tie them up and lock them in your basement and keep them as your prisoner, then you are an aggressor and the burden of proof falls on you, since the force you are using is not demonstrably in retaliation to an initiation of force from the intruder. So the idea that this mode of arbitration promotes any sort of disorderly or indiscriminate violence is absurd. In fact, disorderly and indiscriminate violence is more descriptive of the state's mode of arbitration than it would be one without a state. Now, on to some miscellaneous questions about arbitration. Murder in a stateless society. Well, a charitable organization, community group, family, or insurance plan the victim was a part of or contracted on behalf could file the dispute on their behalf, which is more than likely the manner in which that would be handled, unless a more efficient means of doing so was established, or this is some sort of outlandish and oddly specific scenario that would only further demonstrate the need for individuals to make their own associations on their own terms, and why centralized punitive arbitration is doomed to fail. False accusations? Well, since whoever the arbitration favors against has to pay, this system directly disincentivizes these, something the current system doesn't have any means in place to disincentivize people from doing, at least in the US. Anyway, thank you, Justin, for the request, and I just have to say that I personally enjoyed making this one. It's something that Filthy Heretic covered in his video, The Courts Problem, but I always felt that his video could have been expanded upon, so I hope that I cleared some things up. And to everyone else, thank you for watching. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.